Bitterroot Valley, Montana. November 1891. The first heavy snow had already buried the pine stumps along Sleeping Child Creek when Samuel Cord began dragging salvaged window frames up the hillside to his cabin. 63 years old, lean as jerky, with hands that still knew how to set a trap line in the dark. The locals had watched him survive 26 winters in these mountains. They respected his skill with rifle and steel trap. But this was different. "He's building a glass house," muttered James Whitlock at the trading post, shaking his head. In Montana, for winter, the gathered men laughed. The kind of laughter that comes when someone you respect does something inexplicable. Cord was dragging 8 tall window sashes, their glass intact, salvaged from a collapsed hotel in Darby. He was attaching them to the south wall of his log cabin, creating what looked like a fragile greenhouse lean-to. "That glass won't last one Chinook wind," said Bradley, who'd built half the cabins in the valley. "And even if it does, all that cold glass against his wall might as well invite January inside." But here's what they didn't see. Here's what Cord understood that 20 years of book-learned carpentry had caused these men to forget. And if you want to discover exactly how this ridiculed glass shed became the most efficient heating system in the valley, how it kept Cord's cabin at 45 degrees Fahrenheit while his neighbors burned through cords of wood just to keep water from freezing, then subscribe right now, because I'm about to show you the frontier engineering secret that modern homesteaders are rediscovering today. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and let's see how many of you are dealing with brutal winters right now. Samuel Cord had learned to read the sun the way other men read almanacs. 26 winters trapping lynx and marten had taught him that south-facing rock faces held heat long after sunset, that snow melted first on southern slopes, that the winter sun, low and weak as it was, still carried power if you knew how to catch it. The previous winter had nearly broken him. Not the cold itself. He'd survived colder, but the endless labor of it. Splitting wood in the dark, feeding the fire every 3 hours through the night, waking to a cabin at 34 degrees despite burning through what should have been a month's worth of fuel in a single week. His shoulder ached from the axe. His lungs burned from the smoke. In March, passing through Darby, he'd seen the collapsed Bitterroot Hotel. The structure was ruined, but the windows, tall, double-hung sashes with glass intact, lay in the rubble like gifts. He bought 8 of them for $2 and a smoke ham. The hotel keeper thought he was doing charity for an old man who'd lost his mind. Cord's plan was precise. He would build a lean-to structure against the south wall of his cabin, 12 feet long and 6 feet deep. The frame would be simple pine, but the south-facing wall would be entirely glass, 8 windows floor to ceiling. The east and west ends would be log, chinked tight. The roof would be salvaged tin, angled to shed snow. "It's a cold trap," Whitlock told him directly. "Glass don't hold heat, Sam. It bleeds it. You're building an icebox against your living quarters." Cord just nodded, measuring angles with a length of string and a plumb bob. What he didn't explain, what he knew they wouldn't understand, was that he wasn't trying to hold heat in the glass room. He was trying to catch it. The glass wasn't insulation. It was a trapdoor for sunlight. And the real secret wasn't in the glass at all. It was in what he was building behind it. Between the glass shed and his cabin wall, Cord built something the others couldn't see from the outside. He dismantled the cabin's south-facing wall, just the chinking and outer log layer, and exposed the inner logs. Then he gathered rocks. Not just any rocks, but specific ones. Dark river stones, each weighing between 15 and 40 pounds, selected for their density and color. He stacked these stones against the exposed cabin wall, creating a thermal mass barrier 18 inches deep and 12 feet long. For 1,000 pounds of dark stone, positioned to catch every ray of sunlight that passed through the glass. He mortared them loosely with clay and sand, leaving small gaps for air circulation. "You're making your cabin colder," Bradley insisted, watching the work. "You've taken out your insulation and replaced it with cold rock. That stone's going to suck the heat right out of your living space." But Bradley was thinking about nighttime, about heat loss. Cord was thinking about daytime, about heat capture. The glass would let sunlight through, even weak winter sunlight, and that light would strike the dark stones. Dark surfaces absorb radiation. The stones would warm slowly through the day, and that heat would conduct directly through into his cabin. At night, when the sun was gone, the glass would indeed bleed heat outward, but by then, the stones would be warm, and they'd radiate inward into his living space for hours. The others saw glass and thought window. Cord saw glass and thought funnel. He added one more element that convinced everyone he'd gone fully mad. He built small vents, 4-inch gaps, at the top and bottom of the stone wall, allowing air to flow between the glass room and his cabin. Warm air rises, cold air sinks. The sun would heat the air in the glass room. That air would rise and flow through the top vents into his cabin, and cooler cabin air would flow out through the bottom vents to be reheated. Thermosiphon, Cord said quietly when asked. Thermo what? Whitlock laughed. That's not a word, Sam. But it was. Cord had read it in a book about greenhouses years ago when his eyes were still sharp enough for small print. Natural convection. No pumps, no fans, no complexity. Just physics that had been working since before humans built their first fire. December 11th, 1891. The temperature dropped to 7 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. By December 18th, it had plunged to -12. The kind of cold that made pine trees crack like rifle shots in the night. The kind of cold that froze spit before it hit the ground. Whitlock's family burned through 18 days' worth of split wood in the first week alone. His children slept in the same bed, huddled under elk hides. His wife kept the fire roaring from 4 a.m. until midnight, and still, frost formed on the inside of the cabin walls. At dawn, the interior temperature read 36 degrees, just barely above freezing. Bradley fared better, with his double-wall construction and professional chinking. But he was feeding his firebox every 2 hours, waking twice each night, going through 35 pounds of firewood every 24 hours just to maintain 50 degrees. His hands were raw from splitting. His back screamed each time he bent to load another log. Up at Cord's cabin, smoke rose from the chimney, but not much. A thin stream, inconsistent, nothing like the heavy plumes pouring from other homesteads. He's freezing up there, Whitlock said, watching from the valley. Too proud to ask for help. We should check on him. They rode up on December 19th, expecting to find the old man desperate, maybe frostbitten, certainly low on fuel. They found him sitting outside his cabin in the afternoon sun, eating cold venison, wearing just a wool shirt. The glass shed glittered beside him. Snow melted in a 3-foot radius around its base. How much were you burning, Sam? Bradley asked carefully, trying not to sound concerned. Same log since yesterday morning, Cord replied. Small one. Might last till tomorrow. Whitlock looked at Bradley. Bradley looked at Whitlock. That was impossible. The mathematics didn't work. You couldn't heat a cabin to survivable temperatures in -12-degree weather on one log per 36 hours. The heat loss through the walls alone would require 10 times that fuel. Mind if we look inside? Bradley asked. Cord gestured at the door. Help yourself. And that's where everything they thought they knew about heating a cabin fell apart. The cabin interior read 47 degrees Fahrenheit. In the middle of the afternoon, with outside temperatures at 8 degrees, Samuel Cord's cabin was 47 degrees, and the fire in his small stone hearth had burned down to coals. But it was the glass shed that told the Rayall story. Bradley stepped into the lean-to space and felt like he'd walked into a different season. The thermometer hanging inside read 71 degrees. 71. The dark stones were warm to the touch, not hot enough to burn, but warm like a living thing. The air shimmered slightly with rising heat. The space smelled of warm pine and sun-baked rock. Ow! Whitlock breathed. Cord explained it simply. The sun, even in deep winter, still struck the south-facing glass for roughly 6 hours each day, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. That sunlight passed through the glass and struck the 4,000 pounds of dark stone. The stone absorbed the heat slowly, warming from perhaps 35 degrees in the morning to 55 or 60 degrees by mid-afternoon. That absorbed heat conducted directly through the stone wall into his cabin. But the real power was in the air circulation. The hot air in the glass shed, reaching 70, sometimes 75 degrees on sunny days, rose naturally through the upper vents into his cabin. Cool cabin air flowed out the lower vents, cycled through the glass shed, warmed against the stones, and rose again. A constant, gentle circulation requiring no effort, no fuel, no maintenance. And at night, Bradley asked. "Stones hold it," Cord said. "They take 6 hours to warm up fully. They take 8 to 10 hours to cool back down. So even when the sun's gone, they're still radiating heat inward. I light a small fire around 8 p.m., burn it till midnight. That plus the stone heat keeps me at 42 to 45 degrees all night." Bradley did the math in his head. Cord was burning perhaps 8 pounds of wood per day. Bradley himself was burning 35. Cord was achieving 77% fuel savings compared to standard cabin heating and maintaining nearly the same interior temperature. "How much did the glass cost you?" Whitlock asked quietly. $2 and a ham. The wind picked up outside, howling down from the peaks. In the glass shed, the air barely stirred. The thermal mass damped temperature swings, creating a stable microclimate that fed warmth into Cord's living space hour after hour, day after day, regardless of wind or cloud or blizzard. By January 1892, 7 families in the Bitterroot Valley had begun modifications to their cabins. Not full glass sheds. Glass was expensive and rare, but smaller versions. South-facing lean-tos with 2 or 3 salvaged windows and stone thermal mass walls. The results were immediate and measurable. The Henderson family, living 4 miles downstream, built a 6-foot version using windows from an abandoned schoolhouse and basalt river stones. They reported interior temperatures rising from 38 degrees to 44 degrees without increasing fuel consumption. Their wood usage dropped by an estimated 40% through January and February. Bradley himself, the man who'd called it a cold trap, constructed an 8-foot glass shed attachment in March before the next winter. He used limestone instead of river stones, mortared more carefully, and added a small damper system to control airflow. The following December, he documented his results. Interior temperature of 51 degrees, with wood consumption reduced to 18 pounds per day, a 48% savings compared to the previous winter. Word spread beyond the valley. A trapper from Sula rode up to see Cord's setup in February. By autumn, 3 cabins near Lost Trail Pass had incorporated similar designs. A hunting guide from Hamilton sketched the system and took the drawings to Fort Missoula, where Army engineers studied it with genuine interest. The local criticism disappeared, replaced by something Cord found more uncomfortable: admiration and questions. Men who'd laughed at his glass house now asked detailed questions about stone selection, vent placement, glass angles. He answered patiently, but always with the same caution: don't build what you don't understand. The glass catches the sun. The stones store it. The vents move it. All 3 together. Miss one piece, and you've just built an expensive window. By the winter of 1893, 19 structures within a 50-mile radius had incorporated passive solar thermal mass heating in some form. Not all worked as well as Cord's original. Some builders used light-colored stones, others positioned their glass poorly, a few forgot adequate venting. But even the worst implementations showed 10 to 15% fuel savings. The best matched Cord's numbers: 40 to 50% reduction in wood consumption with stable interior temperatures. The foolish glass shed had become the standard. Samuel Cord died in his sleep in April 1903, 12 years after building his glass shed. He was 74 years old. The cabin and its solar attachment passed to a young Finnish immigrant named Henrik Virtanen, who'd worked Cord's trap lines the previous 2 seasons. Virtanen maintained the system exactly as Cord had built it, adding only one modification: a hinged insulated panel that could be lowered over the glass on the coldest nights to reduce heat loss. The glass shed lasted 41 years. The original windows finally gave out in 1932, cracked by decades of thermal cycling and one particularly vicious hailstorm. By then, Virtanen's son, who'd grown up in that cabin, replaced them with newer double-pane glass and improved the stone wall with better mortar. The system continued working. What Samuel Cord had built wasn't novel in the absolute sense. Attached greenhouses had existed in Europe for centuries. The Romans understood thermal mass. But Cord had synthesized these principles into something specific to his circumstances: abundant stone, salvaged glass, brutal winters, and limited fuel. He created a system that required no maintenance, no purchased fuel, no complexity. Just stone, glass, sunlight, and physics. The broader lesson took longer to arrive. Through the 1930s and 40s, cheap coal and oil made fuel efficiency less urgent. Central heating, forced air, and abundant energy convinced most people that passive systems were primitive and unnecessary. Cord's glass shed, and the dozens like it scattered through Montana and Idaho, were seen as historical curiosities, interesting but obsolete. Then came the energy crisis of the 1970s. Suddenly, architects and engineers began rediscovering what they called passive solar design. They published papers about thermal mass, south-facing glazing, and natural convection. They used terms like Trombe to describe systems nearly identical to what Cord had built 80 years earlier. Some of these modern designers genuinely believed they were inventing something new. They weren't. They were remembering. Today, passive solar heating is recognized as one of the most efficient methods for reducing residential heating costs in cold climates. Modern systems use insulated glass, calculated thermal mass ratios, and computerized models, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged for what that old Montana hunter understood in 1891. Dark mass behind south-facing glass captures and stores solar energy, then releases it slowly over time. The mathematics are now more precise. We know that each pound of stone can store approximately 0.2 BTUs per degree Fahrenheit. We can calculate that Cord's 4,000 pounds of stone, warming from 35 to 60 degrees, stored roughly 20,000 BTUs, equivalent to burning about 1.5 pounds of dry wood. We can model the convective loops, measure the R values, optimize the angles. But Cord didn't need those calculations. He needed to survive winter with a failing body and limited fuel. He looked at what he had: stone, glass, sunlight, and time, and built something that worked. The Vertanen family sold the property in 1967. The cabin was demolished in 1971 to make way for a modern vacation home with electric baseboard heating. The new owners didn't understand what the stone wall was for. They removed it, along with the glass shed framework, and hauled 4,000 pounds of river stones to the dump. The electric heating bill for that new home, for its first winter, exceeded $300 in 1971 currency. $300 to achieve what Cord had done with $2 in ham. There's a broader truth embedded in this story, one that extends far beyond heating cabins. Human beings have been solving problems for thousands of years, and not all of our ancestors were ignorant simply because they lacked electricity or petroleum. They understood materials, climate, and physics in ways that modern convenience has caused us to forget. When we dismiss old techniques as primitive without understanding them first, we often reveal not their ignorance, but our own. Samuel Cord's neighbors called his glass shed foolish until winter proved it brilliant. How many other foolish ideas, from root cellars to stone foundations to corner stoves, have we abandoned not because they failed, but because we stopped understanding why they worked? The old hunter never wrote a book. He never published a paper. He just survived 26 Montana winters, built something sensible with what he had, and showed his neighbors that sometimes the best engineering doesn't come from schools or cities. It comes from paying attention to sunlight, stone, and the simple laws of heat. If this story changed how you think about traditional knowledge and frontier engineering, hit that like button right now and subscribe for more deep dives into the survival techniques that kept our ancestors alive in conditions that would break most modern homes. Drop a comment sharing which old-time technique you think deserves more respect today. Root cellars, stone foundations, earth berming, or something else entirely. Let's keep this conversation going. And remember, before you dismiss something as primitive, make sure you understand what problem it was solving. The glass shed wasn't stupid. The mockery was.